CBS News 24/7, I'm Elizabeth Cook. Let's take a live look at the White House. President Trump answering questions about the widening trade war. The European Union and Canada are upping the ante, hitting the U.S. with billions of dollars of tariffs on American goods. Plus the battle over free speech and immigration status, prompting people to take to the streets in protest across the country. What the government is demanding now in their fight to deport a Columbia graduate and permanent U.S. resident. And the flames are long gone in Southern California, but there are fears that heavy rain could create another danger for people living in Los Angeles and beyond. The Dow is down again today. We're watching Wall Street as President Donald Trump's tariffs create uncertainty in the market. Now, at the same time, we get a bit of a silver lining in new data showing inflation slowed in February. Prices jumped lower than economists expected. Here are the numbers. Prices up 2.8% from a year ago and 0.2% from January. Again, a slower bleed than expected. However, we know millions of you are still feeling it when you check out at the gas pump or maybe at the grocery store. And Trump's 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum kicked in today, threatening to push prices even higher. In a matter of hours, the European Union slapped tariffs right back on the U.S., targeting everything from farm products to motorcycles, bourbon, peanut butter, and even jeans. Canada also vowed to retaliate with more than $20 billion in tariffs on the U.S. Trump doubled down on his plans to impose reciprocal tariffs on the U.S. Take a listen.
The European Union treats us very badly. They have for years. I saw that. I had it out with them in my first term. It did well, but we had to solve other problems, and we did. But European Union's been very tough, and it's our turn too. You know, we get a turn at that also, but they have not been fair. They sue our companies and win massive amounts of money. They sued Apple, won $17 billion, and they use that for other reasons, I guess, or to run the European Union. So I'm not knocking it. They're doing what they should be doing, perhaps, for the European Union, but it does create ill will. And as you know, we're going to be doing reciprocal tariffs. So whatever they charge us, we're charging them. Nobody can complain about that. Whatever it is, it doesn't even matter what it is. If they charge us 25 or 20% or 10% or 2% or 200%, then that's what we're charging them. And so I don't know why people get upset about that, because there's nothing more fair than that. And we had a problem with Ontario, and they dropped that when I let them know what we were going to be doing. They dropped it immediately, so I'm glad, because electricity, you shouldn't be playing with electricity. It affects people's lives. Actually their life. I mean, it can affect, depending on weather, it can affect their life. So we can't do that.
All right, let's bring in CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady. Kelly, I want to get your reaction to what the president just said.
Well, it does seem like we are entering quite a bit of a trade war. I mean, he has threatened come April 2nd for those reciprocal tariffs. They do seem to be stacking up. And, you know, I think what's important, though, is he did just highlight that Ontario kind of rolled back their attempt. So even though that this is feeling very scary, I do want to zoom out that this could be a negotiating tactic. We have seen all of these different countries say things in the news and in the press conferences, but a lot of them have come to the table. So I think with the inflation data that we got today, you know, we're kind of seeing some good things. You are seeing the market react a little bit more volatility, as we have seen. But I think listening to that specifically, we could be in for more pain. But again, it could be a lot of bluster to get people to the table.
Yeah, you mentioned there could be some temporary pain, maybe. How might these countermeasures for the European Union and Canada really impact prices here in the U.S. on you and I?
So the retaliatory tariffs from Canada and the European Union, those are going to impact businesses more. So the peanut butter and the jeans and the Harley Davidsons that you mentioned, those are going to make it more difficult for those companies and industries to sell into these different markets, which are very important to them. We've talked a lot about farmers' lists in the past, you and I, and how that can be debilitating for that industry. it's not going to mean higher prices for us. It's just going to be more difficult for them to sell to those different countries. However, you just heard the president say, well, if they're going to put retaliatory tariffs on us, we are going to slap even more back on them. That's when it hits us, because then it becomes even more expensive to import goods and all sorts of things that we get from these other countries into the U.S. And then that gets passed on to us, the consumer, depending on how much a business that's importing decides to pass that increase on.
One thing we know does impact consumers is inflation. I want to dig a little deeper into today's data. What is the CPI exactly, and what does it mean for our wallets?
So the Consumer Price Index measures how the prices of everyday goods like food, groceries, airline fares, all sorts of things are increasing monthly and annually as well. So that 2% target inflation-wise that the Federal Reserve has been trying to get to. We have seen the CPI increase over the past 4 months. This last month, though, there was some good news. Like you said, we actually decreased a little bit. It still means that prices are rising, just at a slower rate. So that's kind of what it is and how it impacts our wallets. It just tells you how much more you're going to be paying at the grocery store or for your rent, all these different things. What really stood out to me is that we are seeing a little bit of a slowing in inflation. That is good news, because we had been in what we call a sticky inflation environment, where it does feel like this rising price trend has been entrenched in our economy. I think where I pause, though, is a lot of this data did not incorporate the tariff impacts that we are likely going to see. Saw a little bit of that original 10% tariff that was slapped on China going all the way back to the beginning of February. But these next few reports will give more of a complete picture of how tariffs will impact that inflation rate. And that's where you can see it go back up.
All right, we'll be watching for those. Kelly O'Grady, thank you so much. All right, let's turn our monitors back to the White House now, where President Trump and Irish leader Micheál Martin just wrapped up a meeting in the Oval Office. The two leaders answered a number of questions from reporters. And next on the schedule, early St. Patrick's Day celebrations on Capitol Hill. That's happening in just a few hours. We'll have those remarks once they begin. But I want to bring in CBS News White House correspondent Olivia Rinaldi, who's been following this meeting between President Trump and Ireland's Prime Minister there. What stood out to you?
Yeah, it's good to be with you, Liz. They just had this Oval Office bilateral meeting, Trump meeting with the Prime Minister of Ireland, also known as the Taoiseach. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. We've been practicing that here. A couple of things I want to point out from this meeting that we just heard of from President Trump, specifically on that very delicate situation and ceasefire right now between Ukraine and Russia. We, of course, know yesterday that Ukraine said they'd be open to a 30-day ceasefire. Now it's on to the Russians to see if they're going to agree with that. Trump addressing that delicate ceasefire, saying we have half of a ceasefire. Now we need Russia to sign it. He didn't assess any chance of Putin really signing that deal or what concessions would need to be made. He said, I think it makes sense for Russia to sign it. He said they've also discussed potentially a land deal as a result of that as well. That caught my attention as something we should be watching in the coming weeks. But then Trump said we don't want to be wasting time talking about this while we're here. I do want to point out that this morning the Taoiseach had breakfast with Vice President Vance. Secretary Kennedy was also in attendance there, and he spoke about Ukraine in that meeting, where he said in Ukraine, he said that Ireland, rather, is ready to play their part in supporting work to end the conflict in Ukraine and secure peace in Ukraine, Middle East, or elsewhere. So a couple of top lines there just on foreign policy. On policies between the two countries, though, we know, as Kelly just said, the EU slapped about $28 billion worth of tariffs on the U.S. today for typical American products, from Levi's to Harley Davidson. Trump addressed that in that Oval Office meeting, saying the EU's been very tough, and it's our turn too. We get a turn at being tough on them. Trump also said that the U.S. has a massive deficit with Ireland. He said Ireland was very smart and they took our pharmaceutical companies away, and said that a lot of these tariffs and these reciprocal tariffs that the EU is placing on us has caused ill will between the U.S. and the EU. So a lot of tough tension there talking about tariffs in that Oval Office meeting. But as you mentioned, these two leaders are now heading up to Capitol Hill for a very chummy event with the Friends of Ireland up on Capitol Hill today.
Now, as all of this is happening, Olivia, major questions remain unanswered about the Department of Education. Officials say nearly 50% of the workforce will be cut from that department. What can you tell us?
Yeah, this is developing today. We're learning about half of the workforce of the Department of Education is starting to be let go and fired. Just to give you a sense of how many people work in this department, it's only about 4,000, a little over 4,000. Very small compared to other government agencies around D.C. that can billow into several thousand worth of workers that are there. So comparatively a smaller agency, but actually Secretary Linda McMahon last night was on Fox News where she talked about this being essentially the first step in shuttering this agency. This is something Trump has said he's wanted to do. It's something Republicans have said they've wanted to do for a long time, since President Reagan's era when this department was created. But I should note, it takes an act of Congress to get rid of this department. It was created by an act of Congress. It's going to take one to get rid of it. But still, the Trump administration seems to be plowing ahead with shuttering it and sending education back to the states, as they like to say. Still a lot of questions about what that actually looks like, since this department usually just handles federal grants, financial aid, and sets guidelines and recommendations about teaching practices. They're not mandating what education looks like from the federal government down. So a lot of questions specifically about what shuttering this agency is going to look like, particularly in the realm of financial aid. That's what I'm most interested in hearing this, and how that's going to impact some college students around the country.
Yeah, it takes an act of Congress to completely dismantle it, but it looks like the Trump administration is taking it apart piece by piece.
Yeah, and they want to take this fight to the courts. That's kind of been what we've been seeing, especially with, USAID being shuttered several weeks ago, and now we saw that got folded into the State Department, and then officially we saw Secretary Rubio, cancel about 83% of their federal contracts. Now that they've taken it and folded it into the State Department, it's really at their will to do what they want with it. But there's still lawsuits playing out about whether or not they still owe the money that they allocated in these federal contracts. And those were allocated by Congress. So a lot of questions playing out around, at this very granular level about what government actually looks like and what's the role of each branch of government, right? Congress appropriates, the executive branch, does executive orders, and the president serves in that capacity. But we see this president certainly expanding what his executive role is with the power of the pen, but it's Congress that holds the power of the purse. And ultimately, we'll be watching to see how all of these lawsuits around the shuttering of various agencies in Washington, D.C. work out.
All right, Olivia Rinaldi, thanks so much. Good to be with you. Supporters and legal advocates outside a Manhattan courthouse rallying for the release of a pro-Palestinian activist. This after a hearing just ended over his potential deportation. We're talking about this man, Mahmoud Khalil, a legal U.S. resident with a green card who protested against Israel's war in Gaza at Columbia University. Now, immigration agents arrested Khalil over the weekend and sent him to a detention center in Louisiana. That arrest is sparking demonstrations in many parts of the country today. Now, the White House says Khalil's arrest is the first of many, saying the Department of Homeland Security will detain even more people connected with last year's protests. So let's bring it over to CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman, who is at that Manhattan courthouse. Katrina, you just were inside that courtroom. What did you hear?
Liz, the key things that happened in that courtroom were discussions about jurisdiction, as well as Khalil's attorney's ability to access their client. For one, with jurisdiction, as you were saying, he was arrested in New York. Then he was actually brought to New Jersey before he was taken to this ICE facility in Louisiana. What the government is saying is that the Southern District of New York, where we are now, is not the proper forum for this to be heard. Khalil's attorneys argue otherwise. They want him returned to New York. And an issue that we learned they've encountered is since he's been in this Louisiana facility, they haven't been able to have a conversation with him that's protected by attorney-client privilege. There was one conversation that wasn't protected. It was cut off. When they tried to schedule one, the earliest date they were able to get was March 20th. So one thing that the judge ordered today is that they are going to be allowed to have attorney-client privilege calls with him today and tomorrow. They're planning to file an amended habeas petition asking for his release.
As you mentioned, his attorney spoke right after the hearing. Let's listen into some of what he had to say.
Mr. Khalil's detention has nothing to do with security. It is only about repression. The United States government has taken the position that it can arrest, detain, and seek to deport a lawful permanent resident exclusively because of his peaceful, constitutionally protected activism. In this case, activism in support of Palestinian human rights and an end to the genocide in Gaza. The government takes the position that because the Secretary of State finds his dissent unacceptable or contrary to U.S. foreign policy, he can be deported. As Ramzi suggested, it's largely unprecedented, save for ugly historical precedents, including the Red Scare and McCarthyism. That's what we're talking about.
Some pretty big statements there, Katrina. What else stood out to you in that news conference?
I mean, one thing that they talked about is how beyond just Mahmoud Khalil, this is an effort to silence protesters who are protesting the war in Israel and Gaza. And really, from talking to legal sources, they're just also worried about a much wider chilling effect that this could have. But Liz, we also heard from Khalil's wife. They talked about how she is 8 months pregnant. He is 1 month away from becoming a father. He has been separated from her and from his child who is coming soon. In that statement, you also heard them reference something that Secretary of State is relying on, which is this very obscure provision of the Immigration and Nationality Act that has rarely been invoked and also rarely been litigated in court. But there's an interesting fact I learned about this, is that it was once found unconstitutional by President Trump's sister, the now deceased judge, Marianne Barry. That was ultimately dismissed by Judge Alito, who at the time was a circuit court judge, but it's just an interesting precedent in this case.
CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman live for us in Manhattan. Thank you so much, Katrina. Good to be with you. Storms forcing people out of their homes in an area of California already reeling from disaster. You're watching CBS News 24/7. Let's take a live look at L.A. right now and the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. Storms hitting the West Coast and with force, bringing rain and gusty winds up and down the state. And in Los Angeles, back-to-back storms are bringing the threat of mudslides. Some people living in the areas burned by this year's wildfires are being forced to pack up and leave the area again. We're talking Sierra Madre, where there are evacuation orders and warnings are in effect for those high-risk areas. The storm comes just weeks after another powerful system slammed the area with even more heavy rain, bringing mud flows onto neighborhoods. And now residents are concerned that the same thing could happen again.
It was dangerous. It was 4 or 5 feet of mud, and it comes down fast. So when they say evacuate, I'm evacuating. There's no sticking around.
We are expecting there to be much more debris and mud this time around.
Now, crews have been working around the clock to clear debris above these homes. But Zoe, this area cannot catch a break. And you remember that earth is so unstable because of the wildfires and then the mudslides on top of it.
Yeah, so when the wildfire goes through, it creates a layer of what's known as hydrophobic soil. So the entire top layer of soil, water can't absorb into it like it normally does. So it just picks up the soil and all the debris and all of the gross stuff on the ground, and it allows it to just flow right down. And we're also dealing with what's known as an atmospheric river. And I'm sure you've heard this term many, many times before. But what exactly is it? It is just a narrow stream of water in the upper levels of the atmosphere. It's the same thing as a river on the ground, but in the atmosphere. It's just a layer of moisture that is funneling into one tiny area. It's like a fire hose of moisture that's going to continue to make its way down the entirety of the west coast of the United States. You can see that fire hose of moisture again going to be pushing past the Bay Area this afternoon and continuing to push south over Southern California into our overnight hours. Taking a look on the ground, though, showing you what has already happened and what is happening right now. A lot of rain across the Pacific Northwest and far northern California. Again, the line of stronger showers and thunderstorms are beginning to develop. And this line of showers and storms will continue to push south over the next several hours. Again, we are expecting some very gusty winds, quite a lot of snow as well. And again, Southern California going to be hit the hardest by this system. Los Angeles, the areas that did deal with the burn scars, now going to be dealing with burn scar flash flooding, along with quite a lot of snow. You noticed it wasn't just rain, also snow falling with with winter storm warnings, winter storm advisories, 4 feet possible by the time all things are said and done through the end of the week. Again, this storm system, though, going to continue to track farther south late tonight. Look at our view at about 2 a.m. This is when Los Angeles and Southern California will be dealing with the mudslides and the burn scar flash flooding. It's an overnight system, so keep your alerts on loud. Evacuate today if they tell you to. Please stay safe. There is a slight good news with this system. It's a quick mover. It should be out of your hair by later Thursday afternoon, and then hopefully you could pick up some pieces and begin to dry out. Back to you.
Zoe, thank you. President Donald Trump sweeping 25% tariffs on foreign steel and aluminum imports kicked in today. Hours later, Canada promised to announce more than $20 billion in retaliatory tariffs on the U.S. Now, the counter tariffs expected to hit American computers, sports equipment, cast iron products, and much more. And Trump's on and off trade policy has some Americans feeling tariff whiplash. Are Canadians feeling too? What's the atmosphere like in Canada with the day-to-day changes? I want to bring in David Aiken here from our partners there in Canada. David, how are Canadians feeling about all of this?
Yeah, tariff whiplash is exactly the right term. And of course, in the United States, you're sort of just catching on to it now. It's been like this since the beginning of the Trump administration for Canada, and there's a great deal of frustration and a great deal of anger. Travel to the United, you can see it's winter here. Canadians like to go to Arizona or Florida, watch some spring training this time of year, and travel by Canadians to the United States destinations, Vegas, etc. It's down by about 18%. So big tariff whiplash up here. And it's likely going to get worse because remember, Canada and others around the world are responding with retaliatory tariffs today because of these steel and aluminum tariffs. But America had put some tariffs on Canadian goods a couple of weeks ago, and we've already got retaliatory tariffs on about $30 billion Canadian of American imports. So what we did today is on top of that $30 billion. And let me keep going here. There's another deadline coming up on April the 2nd. Trump has talked about, quote, reciprocal tariffs. We don't exactly know what all that means, but some more rounds of tariffs from Trump going to be levied on Canada and others around the world on April the 2nd. And if that happens, then Canada will respond with some more retaliatory tariffs on about $120 billion Canadian of more American imports. The bottom line on this tariff whiplash is stuff is getting more expensive for Americans. Stuff is getting more expensive for Canadians. You may have seen the White House press secretary yesterday saying the mind-bogglingly ridiculous statement that a tariff is a tax cut. No, a tariff is a tax, and it's paid by importers, and it forces prices up. And that's what's happening right now because of this tariff whiplash on both sides of the border.
I want to talk about this, though, David. Ontario paused the export tariff on electricity, but you got to know that this could be reactivated if tomorrow's meeting with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and Ontario's Premier Doug Ford goes off the rails, which it could. Tell us about that.
That's right. So the Ontario Premier Doug Ford, Ontario's Canada's biggest province, Ontario Premier Doug Ford, so frustrated with this whiplash, he warned for several weeks that he was going to impose a 25% export tariff on about 1.5 million Americans in New York, in Michigan, in Minnesota that use Ontario electricity. And he followed through on that, and that's what he put on Monday. Trump hit the roof. Trump on social media talked about shutting down the Canadian auto industry. So Howard Lutnick phoned up Doug Ford and said, hold on, we got to calm things down. And Ford decided to pause these electricity tariffs. But I think, and then Trump started talking about, well, why are we buying electricity from Canada anyway? It's such a small area. And maybe Americans ought to know, it's not just 1.5 million homes in the very northern parts of the country. I looked it up today. There's a lot of American states that rely on Canadian electricity. Maine gets its electricity from New Brunswick. New York, Michigan, Minnesota from Ontario. Minnesota, North Dakota, Wisconsin gets its hydro from Manitoba. And the New England power grid, that's Massachusetts, Connecticut, etc., they get Canadian electricity as well. Now, the Premier of Ontario, it was Doug Ford who put on that export tariff. The premiers of these other provinces, Manitoba, New Brunswick, and British Columbia, way out on the west, they're a bit reluctant to put an export tax on, but they're not taking it off the table. And at the end of the day, it's the federal government who really can put on any export tax it wants. Electricity is one thing. Another thing that the Canadian government is thinking of making more expensive for Americans is potash. What's potash? Potash is a fertilizer that every farmer in the Midwest U.S. uses, and if potash goes up, your food prices go up. So that is what Canada is prepared to retaliate with, export tariffs, to make things more expensive for American consumers, so American consumers can send a really clear message to Donald Trump: these tariffs are a tax. They ain't a tax cut. They make life more expensive. And he promised, of course, to make life less expensive. Well, he's not doing that with these tariffs.
Yeah, David, you alluded to this in our first question. You know, Canadians are really hurt by this. They're taking it very personally. We saw a video last week of a Canadian liquor store, employees pulling American bottles off the shelves. What reactions are you seeing from some of the smaller Canadian businesses?
Yeah, so in many provinces, not all, the control of liquor sales, it's a provincial monopoly. There's a Liquor Control Board of Ontario or one in BC, and yes, they pulled all the Jack Daniels, all the bourbon, all the Oregon wine, all the California wine is gone from pretty much any outlet. Ontario alone, I think, spends something like $4 or $5 billion buying American booze a year. So that's one thing, and that's nobody in Canada is complaining about that. We can find wine from other parts of the world just fine, and we're drinking rye whiskey instead of Kentucky whiskey. In any event, that's one thing. That's a lot of money, and I know that Jack Daniels is complaining bitterly. And now you may have seen the European Union is also putting a tariff, a retaliatory tariff, on whiskeys and on Harley-Davidson motorcycles in response to Trump's tariffs. So Canadians are looking for any and all ways they can to stop buying American, stop traveling to America. There's lots of law firms that are prepared to hold, conferences in the desert in Arizona this time of year. Their companies will have their annual meetings in the States. Not doing that. They're canceling those. So this has got everybody annoyed. And again, as every Canadian political leader has said, from the Prime Minister to his Finance Minister to all these premiers, this is not because Canadians do not like Americans. It's because of the actions of one Donald Trump, and that's what they're trying to press right now.
Yeah, there are friendly neighbors to the north, and right now it's not such a friendly relationship. Global News and Chief Political Correspondent David Aiken, always good to be with you. Thank you so much for joining us. A House subcommittee meeting abruptly ends after a GOP lawmaker misgenders a fellow member of Congress. I'll show you that tense exchange when we come back. You're watching CBS News 24/7. Welcome back to CBS News 24/7. Let's take you back to Capitol Hill, where House Speaker Mike Johnson pulling out a big win for his party and the Trump administration on that stopgap funding bill to avert a government shutdown. Now, Johnson did manage to secure enough votes to narrowly pass the measure in a 2017 to 2013 vote. These two, the only members to step out of ranks with their party. That is Congressman Jared Golden from Maine, the lone Democrat to vote yes, and as expected, Republican Congressman Thomas Massie from Kentucky with that no vote. Now remember, President Trump called Congressman Massie out on Truth Social for his stance. Well, the president followed up last night again, calling Massie, quote, a grandstander. Now keep in mind, this is not a done deal. The legislation now goes to the Senate, and the clock is ticking. If the Senate can't get on board with this, the government will shut down on Friday. With that, let's bring in CBS News congressional reporter Torian Small with a new haircut. Nice to see you, Torian. You are watching the numbers on the Senate side. Walk us through the math here.
Yeah, so normally in a chamber over here, when it comes to these votes, in order to bypass that filibuster, Republicans need at least 7 Democrats to come across the aisle, considering they have 53 Republicans on their side. This time around, though, Senator Rand Paul was the first Senate Republican to come out against this bill, saying it's a hard no because the spending cuts aren't deep enough. That is kind of the same language we heard from his colleague from Kentucky in the House, Thomas Massie, who was ultimately the lone Republican to vote for this bill. That means 8 Democrats will have to vote against or vote for this bill in order for this to go to the president's desk. We also know Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska gave a speech on the floor recently saying that she's stuck between a rock and a hard place because she doesn't like the logistics of this continuing resolution, but she also doesn't like the prospect of a government shutdown happening. We also know 3 Democrats or folks who caucus with Democrats here in the Senate are also on the fence. That's Senators Hickenlooper, Angus King, and Gallego from Arizona. They said they're waiting to see the language of the bill, and then they'll come to a decision a little bit later on down the road. But this is clearly something that has quite a few lawmakers divided, Liz.
Yeah, and Friday's coming up quick, Torian. What's the timeline on when we can see a vote here?
So there are quite a few procedures that happen before final vote could happen, and that will likely be on Friday. Before there has to be a cloture vote. So this is a procedural vote that shows whether or not a bill has support to actually make it to a final vote. That would still require 60 votes in favor in order for it to advance. So that's the true test here. That could happen as early as tomorrow, leaving very little time for this bill to pass. If, for example, if that bill doesn't go through that closure vote, if it doesn't pass, then that means it's back to the drawing board. Most likely a clean CR that we've seen before in the past that was able to get consensus from both sides of the aisle. But again, we have until Friday at midnight for something to happen, which is a much smaller window for this to get passed and ultimately sent to the president's desk.
Well, speaking of the president, Torian, he is on Capitol Hill today. What's his schedule?
Yeah, he's meeting with members. It's called the Friends of Ireland. So after a meeting at the White House today, he's on the Hill for a luncheon hosted by Speaker Johnson to meet with the Prime Minister of Ireland there. It's also quite the event set up. There are river dancers from the Kennedy Center there also greeting them. This is part of diplomatic events and activities happening today. Again, he met at the White House first before heading to the Hill. But yeah, it's a visit that's not likely to yield any conversations around the CR talks. But the president coming to the Hill is always quite the fanfare either way, Liz.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to hear those river dancers in there at Capitol Hill. I'm sure it's going to echo through those halls. All right, CBS News congressional reporter Torian Small, always great to see you. Well, a House subcommittee hearing ended abruptly when a Republican congressman misgendered Democratic Representative Sarah McBride. She is the first openly transgender lawmaker in Congress. Watch.
I now recognize the representative from Delaware, Mr. McBride.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ranking Member Keating, also wonderful.
Mr. Chairman, could you repeat your introduction again, please?
Yes, we have set the standard on the floor of the House, and I'm simply...
What is that standard, Mr. Chairman? Would you repeat what you just said when you introduced a duly elected representative from the United States of America? Please.
I will. The representative from Delaware, Mr. McBride.
Mr. Chairman, you are out of order. Mr. Chairman, have you no decency? I've come to know you a little bit, but this is not decent.
We will continue this
hearing. You will not continue it with me unless you introduce a duly elected representative the right way.
This hearing is adjourned.
Congressman Keith Self suddenly adjourned the meeting after getting some pushback from Democratic lawmaker Bill Keating. Now, Sarah McBride took to social media after that hearing and wrote, quote, "No matter how I'm treated by some colleagues, nothing diminishes my awe and gratitude at getting to represent Delaware in Congress. It is truly the honor and privilege of a lifetime. I simply want to serve and to try to make this world a better place." And Representative Keith Self posted this online, quote, "It is the policy of the United States to recognize two sexes, male and female." Coming up, mixed results from Greenland's election, and it will affect Trump's plans to take over the territory. We'll talk to USA Today's Kim Helgard next. In Greenland, a party that favors a gradual path to the territory's independence from Denmark has pulled off a surprise win in the parliamentary elections. Leaders there say the result sends a clear message to President Donald Trump that Greenland is not for sale. Now, the territory is in the spotlight after President Trump voiced his interest in taking control of the island. Trump told a joint session of Congress last week he thought the U.S. would get Greenland one way or the other. He did later clarify that he supports the people of Greenland's right to determine their own future. USA Today World Affairs correspondent Kim Helgard joins us now. Kim, thank you so much for being with us. This is considered an upset victory. Talk to us a little bit about the Democratic Party.
Yeah, you're right. From the Trump administration perspective, it is kind of the dreaded mixed result. The outcome was both surprising and not. The unsurprising part is that the Democratic Party, which is a center-right party led by Jens Friedrich Nielsen, as you noted, sort of said the result should send a clear message to Trump that Greenland is not for sale. This is a party that wants independence. It just doesn't want it straight away. Now, it's a pro-business opposition party, and what it's essentially looking to do is it wants more commercial activity in Greenland, basically to finance Greenland's welfare state, so the schools, education, health, all that. The surprising part is the part that the party that came in second, the Nalarik party, which also wants independence, but it doesn't want it to happen as quickly as it wants it to happen more quickly. It wants closer ties to the U.S. It's just that it's stopped well short of characterizing, these ties as anything like it wants to become America's 51st state.
So what does this all mean for Trump's plans to take over Greenland?
Well, first thing we should say is we haven't heard from Trump this morning yet, since these results. Trump has not ruled out anything militarily or economically, since he started this process. Tariffs, as we're finding out, are kind of a central part of Trump, of the way that Trump seems to like to get things done. So I think it stands to reason that, he could try to sort of squeeze Greenland and Denmark together economically through tariffs. There is a sort of another point that's worth mentioning, which is essentially that this party that came in second, this Nalarik party, because they want independence so quickly, they also have said that they favor closer ties with the U.S. Even though they don't want to become part of the U.S. And so, in a sense, the White House may have found a kind of kindred spirit in one of the parties that did well in this vote. But overall, I guess I would sort of rely on what, Danish political scientists have told me in recent days, which is that basically, quote unquote, quote, unless Trump does something sort of nuts, end quote, in the form of an aggression or a crazy reaction, they don't think that anything is going to happen straight away, and that, Greenland over the long term will probably get independence. It could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, it could be 20 years away.
All right, Kim Helgard from USA Today, thank you so much for being with us. Well, the people that found this crashed car stuck down a ditch had a big shock when the driver told them just how long she'd been stuck inside. How the woman trapped in that wreckage actually used a sweater to keep herself alive. Stay with us here on CBS News 24/7. The investigation into this fiery crash off the coast of England has turned into a criminal probe. UK police have detained the captain of a cargo ship that collided with an oil tanker on Monday. The captain has been identified as a Russian national, and both vessels are still smoldering days after that crash. The captain hasn't been charged yet, but was arrested on suspicion of manslaughter. That cargo ship hit a tanker on Monday, which was carrying huge amounts of jet fuel for the U.S. military. A missing crew member from the cargo ship is presumed dead after dozens of others were rescued. Now imagine this terrifying scenario: being down in a ditch, stuck in a car for almost a week, trapped while drivers are just passing by, unable to see you. Well, that's exactly what happened to this woman in Indiana. CBS News Chicago reporter Marissa Sulek has her story of survival and how she actually used a sweater to keep herself hydrated.
We finally got good news.
It's the good news the family of Breonna Castle never expected to hear after the mom of 3 went missing in Newton County, Indiana last week.
There are over 400 cars that were passing her a day.
Castle's mom, Kim Brown, says her daughter visited her Wednesday night, but days later, she hadn't heard from her.
She said she fell asleep, and I guess there was a bridge there, and she just veered over to the left and missed the bridge and ended up in a very deep ditch.
Newton County Sheriff's Office says Castle's car fell into this ditch off a rural county road. The back of the car immersed in a creek.
She also told her daughter that she was giving up hope this morning. She was giving up hope that anybody was going to find her.
The people call me hero,
but Johnny Martinez says he was driving a 10-foot tall tractor Tuesday morning when he spotted her car.
And so I was like, Johnny, there's somebody in there.
He called the Morocco Fire Chief Jeremy Vanderall, who came out to help. They say they recognized Castle from a missing persons report. She was screaming for help and thought she was going to die, but her cardigan saved her.
She'd been dipping it down in the ditch to get water. It had, it wicked up the water into the shirt, and she would suck the water out of her shirt. Her survival mode just was uncanny, her will to live.
Johnny Martinez, thank you so much for finding my baby.
Castle's family says they would not be here if it weren't for Martinez and Vanderall. They look forward to spending time with Castle as she recovers.
I just can't wait to hug her and kiss her, which I probably can't do.
It's amazing she's alive. And it's amazing she also used a sweater to collect drinking water just to stay hydrated. Brilliant, right? She was hurt in the crash and was airlifted to the hospital. Her family says she has a long road to recovery, but they are incredibly grateful that she was found. Well, in a time when dancing on social media is all the rage among high schoolers and college students, West Virginia University coach Rich Rodriguez is banning his football players from dancing on TikTok. He says making those videos diminish the hard edge his team should be portraying, and banning this particular activity is a way to refocus the program. Well, we are counting down to liftoff of a SpaceX rocket tonight from Florida. 4 astronauts gearing up to head to the International Space Station. Their arrival will start the process of bringing NASA astronauts Suni Williams and Butch Wilmore finally back home to Earth. They've been at the space station since June. Their stay was extended after their ride home, a Boeing Starliner spacecraft malfunctioned. Our live look now at the launch pad at the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida. We'll have much more coverage leading up to blastoff, and we'll bring you that moment live right here on CBS News 24/7. We're also keeping an eye on the storms bringing snow to Northern California and creating dangerous conditions in some areas burned by those destructive wildfires in Southern California. We'll have much more on that. Stay with us right here on CBS News 24/7.